everybody, Kristen here, and as you can tell by the way that I am dressed, today we are going to be talking about fantasy books, and not just any kind of fantasy books. We're going to be talking about YA fantasy. Now, the only reason why we're only going to be talking about YA fantasy and not the full spectrum of fantasy is because I will be sitting here for like hours talking about fantasy books because I could, because fantasy books are my favorite kind of books. I'm just going to go ahead and dive in because this is going to be a very long video, and just like other genre talks that I've had, I'm not going to be talking about every single fantasy book that is out there that you can buy. I'm only going to be talking about the ones that I've read, and I'm only going to be talking about the ones that I like, because there's so many kinds of fantasy books out there, and I like specific kinds of fantasy. I am going to be talking a little bit about each subgenre of fantasy, so you can kind of get an idea of what those all entail. At the end of the video, if you want to go ahead and click the little box down below, I'll give a list of all the books that I talked about in this video. Let's do this. So we're going to go into the different kind of subgenres. There are so many types of fantasy books out there. It's ridiculous. It's hard to keep track, and it's almost impossible to talk about one kind of fantasy without bringing in another. The most generic kind of fantasy that you're going to get is high fantasy. High fantasy is what you think about when you think about fantasy books. There's generally magical elements to them. They generally have magical creatures. There's some kind of journey that is that the characters are going on. High fantasy are very character-driven books. Epic fantasy is what we think of when we think of Tolkien. He does epic fantasy. He is the father of epic fantasy. Epic fantasy usually revolves around a large cast of characters with one main focus, and that main focus character is always going to be a hero. He's going to save the day from the evil in the world. It's a good versus evil story is epic fantasy. When you go into the other subgenres of fantasy that aren't as widely known or aren't seen really, there is gothic fantasy, which I kind of look like I'd be in a gothic fantasy novel. There's urban fantasy, which is basically any kind of fantasy story set in a modern setting, usually in New York or like Prague or like very large urban settings is urban fantasy. There's paranormal fantasy, which centers around like vampires and ghosts and witches and mystics and kind of things like that. There's historical fantasy, actual events that have happened in history intermingled with fantasy. There's just so many kinds. There's even modern fantasy, which are more contemporary type novels that have fantasy elements to them. There's romantic fantasy, which I'm down for one of those any day of the week. Sci-fi is also considered fantasy, so when you open that up, there's a whole nother can of worms. So there's so many types of fantasy novels. There's a fantasy novel out there for everybody. You can get steampunk, you can get anything you want in a fantasy novel. They're just all-encompassing, and they're so great and so fantastic, and that's why I love them so much, because everybody can have a fantasy novel that they love to read. So I'm just going to go ahead and talk about some of my favorite YA fantasy books, and the first series that I want to talk about is Mistborn by Sanderson, and I do not have a physical copy because it's on my e-reader and I don't want to have to finagle with all of that. It's actually one of my favorite fantasy series in general. It is amazing. It is such a good story. It's so well told. Sanderson has a way with words. Every single one of his books is absolutely amazing. He writes not only fantasy, but he also does have a new sci-fi series, and he's just like this all-encompassing amazing fantasy writer, and you definitely need to read those books if you haven't already. The next series I want to talk about is the Throne of Glass series by Sarah J. Maas. I'm gonna hold up Heir of Fire because Heir of Fire is my favorite of the books so far. Queen of Shadows comes out on the 1st of September, which is like 2 days away. I already have my copy and I started it already, but I'm trying to like hold off on finishing it just because there's going to be another year until it's out, and I'm sad about it, the next book, and I just know that she's going to kill me in all my feels. But Heir of Fire is my favorite of the Throne of Glass books. The Throne of Glass novels do follow a young woman who is an assassin. I can't talk too much about it because it's impossible to talk about these books without giving away spoilers because there's so much stuff that happens. I do want to say though that Sarah J. Maas is the only fantasy author that has ever made me like fairies. I hate fairies. They're my least favorite mythical creature. I do not like reading about them. I do not like anything about them. Not even a little bit. But Sarah J. Maas, the way that she talks about the Fae, the way that she writes about the Fae, actually make me really love these stories about the Fae. She has her own brand of Fae that she brings to the table, and I absolutely love it. And they're ferocious and amazing, and I just can't get enough of these books. Speaking of Sarah J. Maas, I'm going to talk about another series that she's writing. That is A Court of Thorns and Roses. This is her second fantasy series, and it revolves around the Fae as well. Completely different kind of heroine than in the Throne of Glass books, whereas Selena Sardathian in the Throne of Glass novel, she is very feminine yet assassin, and she dates a lot, and she has all of these powers that are untapped, and she really is finding her way. In this book, she's a heroine by default because she has to provide for her family, and she's forced into a situation where she has to be the hero, and she gets taken to the land of the Fae in this book as penitence for killing a Fae. And that all happens in the first chapter. I promise I'm not spoiling anything by telling you guys that if you haven't read these books yet. Her story is more about a mortal going into this land, this magical land, and spending her whole life hating the Fae and then being thrust upon them. And it's very good. It's kind of like a retelling of Beauty and the Beast. She always has sort of a fairy tale retelling aspect to her books. And this one's Beauty and the Beast. The second book in the series is going to be more like the myth of Persephone and Hades, and I'm really excited about reading that one. The next book I want to talk about, or the next series that I want to talk about, are also a series of fairy tale retellings. This is the second book in the series. It's by Rosamund Hodge. This is Crimson Bound. The first book in the series is called Cruel Beauty, and if you have watched any of my videos, you know how much I love Cruel Beauty, and I talk about it all the time. I love fairy tale retellings of my favorite stories. This is a fairy tale retelling of Red Riding Hood. This is amazing. I loved this book more than I like Cruel Beauty. I had little slow spots in this book though, where I was like, oh, I don't know, and then the end just blew me away, and I really loved it. It's a really interesting take on Red Riding Hood. It's not like your traditional little girl and wolf. The wolf is a bigger aspect, the devourer, and she is one of bound to him. He is going to eventually take over the world and make the world this dark forest. It's really good. I really love this book. Next book I want to talk about is The Wrath and the Dawn. Oh my god, this book is amazing. This story is amazing. This is one of the best books that I've read so far this year. It's so good. It's not like a typical fantasy story. There's a lot of magic in it, but it's all kind of hidden below the surface. Whereas with most fantasy books, you get that surge of, oh, look at all of this magic. And this one, it's all kind of hidden below the surface. And with the next book, you're going to get more of it. And I definitely recommend reading this book if you haven't already, just because it is my favorite book so far of the year. Next series I want to talk about is the Grisha Trilogy by Leigh Bardugo. I actually just held a read-along on my Tumblr a few months ago. Absolutely love it. The Darkling in this book is my favorite bad guy of all bad guys ever. I just absolutely love the Darkling. The way that she wrote this bad guy in this story is so amazing, because there's just something refreshing about having a villain that doesn't have a tragic backstory. I hate that when authors try to redeem their villains by giving them this crazy backstory of why they are the way they are, and I just love having a villain that just is a villain. Alina, the heroine in this story, I love her. I love morally gray characters. They're some of my favorite characters in stories. I do not like characters that are inherently good by right. I like them to struggle with the good and evil, because that's what people do every single day. They struggle with the good and evil in their lives and who they are, and I just love reading that in characters. The next series I want to talk about is the Daughter of Smoke and Bone series, and this is by Laini Taylor. I do love this series. This is a high fantasy series to the max. This, just like Mistborn, this is going to be a true high fantasy series. Just like any high fantasy setting or high fantasy story, there is a lot of world building and a lot of build up. So whereas this first book, you're getting to know the characters, so you're really into it, the second and third books are really building the story for the epic conclusion. So you got to keep that in mind when you're reading these books, because a lot of people give up because it does have slow spots, and YA books tend to not. But in fantasy, they do have those slow spots because there's so much that they're trying to explain in such a small amount of time to make things make sense. So that's what she does, is she extends these books to have more detail and to have more world building and character building, so that you get an idea of what is going on. And I love these books, and she did it so well. Has one of my favorite secondary characters of all time, and that is Zuzana. And definitely read these books. When I had my blue hair, I thought I was Karu. I really did. I miss it sometimes. It is about Chimera and angels. I love books about Chimera. I do. I love Chimera when they're done right. The next series I want to talk about is the Graceling Realm series, and this is by Kristen Cashore. I love these books. If you are looking for a really good book that deals with a lot of things that women actually deal with on a day-to-day, these do not shy away from sexuality. They do not shy away from women struggling in a male-driven society. These books have a lot of morally gray areas. The characters they struggle with themselves to be what they are not expected to be. As always, you cannot talk about fantasy without talking about Harry Potter. It is the all-encompassing fantasy series. It is amazing. I absolutely love Harry Potter. I have 7 Harry Potter tattoos. I've been to every, book release. I've been to every movie release. I absolutely love it. And there's not a person in the world that I know that doesn't love it, that has read it. It's really just kind of amazing that this kind of a story and this kind of a series really is the voice of not just one, but several generations, and always will be. I was 12 when this series was published. And so I was just about a year older than Harry in the first book, the first time I read it. And it's just really stuck with me throughout my entire life. I know that it's that for a lot of people. So Harry Potter will always be my favorite YA fantasy series, always. It'll always be one of my favorite fantasy series in general. And I love it. I love my Harry Potter. I also wanted to talk about a book of short stories. This is going to be more paranormal fantasy. I actually just got this book, and it is a compilation of short stories having to do with witches. And it has so many authors in it. It's so good. It has like Laini Taylor and Rochelle Mead, who wrote the Vampire Academy books, and Cami Garcia, who wrote the Beautiful Creatures books. There's Malinda Lo, who wrote some of my favorite fantasy books as well, which I actually want to talk about real quick. Ashton Huntress. They are some YA that have gay and bi protagonists, and which is really amazing. Well, more lesbian and female bi protagonists, and they're a really great story retelling of Cinderella. And then she has a story in here as well. Meg Cabot. Just love these. I just loved it. There's so many cute little short stories. Those are some of my favorite YA fantasy series. I have so many on my shelves that I haven't read yet, like The Fallen Kingdoms, Young Elites by Marie Lu, which I love Legend, and I really want to read that. I have Talon by Julie Kagawa. That is about dragons. I just have so many fantasy books. I do want to do an honorable mention real quick about a series that isn't YA but could be classified YA, because people tend to do it all the time anyway, even though it is an adult fantasy series that has a YA aged protagonist, and that's Queen of the Tearling by Erika Johansen. I actually have a book talk for that book, and Invasion of the Tearling just recently came out, and that's the second book in the series, and it's amazing. It follows a young woman named Kelsey, who gets thrust into queendom and her navigating that, and there's a lot of magical elements. It's kind of dystopian, kind of high fantasy, and it's just all around amazing. Glad I got all of that out real quick as I could. I want to talk about more fantasy books eventually in the future. I just wanted to get this out there real quick. There's so many different fantasy books out there. Why don't you guys tell me what some of your favorite fantasy books are in the comment section below? And if I haven't read them yet, I will definitely check them out. I want to do an adult fantasy genre talk eventually. That one's going to be really long because I mainly read adult fantasy stories. So we will come back to that another day. But everybody have a great week. Enjoy this fall-like weather. I don't know if this is like this everywhere, but it's like 60 degrees and rainy outside today, and it's absolutely amazing. So everybody have a great day, and I will see you next time.